All right, here we are. This is Kinesiology 230. This is still chapter 23, but this is a bit of a sidebar conversation. What you see on the screen here is an Excel spreadsheet, and I went into a college and did some presentations regarding program design for sport-specific training. And this was an example of a fall sport going over a fall sport that was in season in the fall of 24 and then off-season programming going into the 2025 calendar year. Now, what we have to have in mind is uh, academic years and calendar years do not align. They overlap, right? They're a little bit off center with each other. An academic school year doesn't begin January 1st. It actually begins a couple of weeks into January, and then the fall doesn't begin right on July 1st, which would be the 6th month of the year, second half of the year. It's in August. So when we look at this, let me go ahead and scroll this here. When we look at this, what you have is in August, in season denoted in gray. And if you just think back to our pyramid of Roy G. Biv, and I have an example of this for the off-season stuff you'll see here in a second, but we have the hypertrophy phase. The athletes come in August. They're in the in-season mode, IS. So here they are in in-season mode. They come in. They have a hypertrophy phase starting off in the end of August, going in September. They were scheduled to report on the 30th. I think it was actually the 29th, and they were going to start their in season on Friday the 30th. So that's why it looks awkward. But you ended up having or the way I programmed it out was a 3-week hypertrophy phase. And that hypertrophy phase was higher volume, lower intensity, everything we've talked about. And then while they're still in season, we switch to base strength, which is that orange. And then we go yellow, which is strength, and then green, which is power. And then that power carries over into November where we have peaking. And what we're shooting for there is the reason why I decided to have that peaking phase during that week in November is that was the conference tournament it was for women's soccer, if I have my sports correct. And so with the women's soccer, we know that we wanted them to peak during that time. So we had a manipulation in the loading parameters where as we were going through the programming, we went from a high volume phase to a lower volume phase with higher intensity. But during this week, we backed off the overall intensity, or another way to say that is I backed off the overall total volume load or total volume percent load on the athletes to allow them the opportunity to be quick, poppy, fresh, explosive, whatever you want to use to describe the process when they went in to play their conference match later on in the weekend on the 9th. So here's the thing, they're still in season, but if they won, if they won during conference, then they go to regional, right? And if they won there, then they're going to have a nationals on 6 and 7. That's denoted in black here, 6, 7, and 8. So what you have is a situation where during the season for a sport like women's soccer or other sports that are like this, you have these kind of undulating peaks and valleys where you have to peak them. And I'm sure if you've ever done a sport that's like cross country or track or soccer or wrestling's another one, where you have to peak for the playoffs, but you got to peak just right to be able to carry that through when you win to go to the next round, when you win to go to the next round, etc. So if they lost, at that point, then we go into a short red again, which would be a hypertrophy phase, going into what would be finals week. Now, regardless, if we won nationals at that point over 6th, 7th, and 8th, or if they lost in conference and we went right into a hypertrophy phase, what I would have them do is basically, to be quite honest, it would look less like hypertrophy and it would look more like active recuperation more than anything else because they would be pretty gassed after this whole season. But long story short, I would have them, my suggestion to the coaching staff was have your athletes be responsible to come in and do some kind of workout that's out of the context of what they're used to. And then make sure during this week, during finals, that they don't have an actual obligation to come in because they're already going to be stressed out anyways because of finals. Give them the option to come in and work out on their own and use that as a tool for stress reduction as opposed to applying another stressor on them during finals week. send them off. They go off to Christmas. They're probably not going to do much during the holiday. And then start to have them key back in. Make sure they do a little something during those weeks. Maybe give them a couple coaching points, things that they can do. But when they come back in January, this gets back to our Roy G. Biv down here. We have red, orange, yellow, green, blue. If you look at this over the context of 2025, what happens is this, because we have an entire year to work with, and we know that we're asking them to come in for in August. This would be when they would report for the fall season. Have a 2-week hypertrophy in an off season one, and we'd have a 2-week hypertrophy, 2-week base strength, 2-week strength, and then you'd have 1-week power phase. With this, we know we just don't have the time to really take them through a properly programmed hypertrophy base strength power peaking, and especially if this was maybe some of the newer athletes perhaps came in from another school and they have no background in training at all, then we know that this is going to be mostly hypertrophy over the first couple of weeks anyways. But because they had some exposure to programming in the previous year during the in-season, we knew we could get a little bit of hypertrophy, a little bit of base strength, and power, and send them off to spring break. And that's the gray here, and that's what I was viewing as active recovery. Depending on what your athletes do on spring break, it might be active something else. It could be partying on the beach, whatever it is, but it is not training or working out. We know this. When they come back, we're in off season 2. That's OS2. Again, we're going to go to 2-week hypertrophy, 2-week base strength, 2-week strength, and then 2 weeks of power, give or take, and then we go into finals week. So we have a week-ish to go into finals, and depending on how this mapped out, we were looking at having them do during that power phase to do perhaps like a 4-rep test out. But again, here we are in finals. This is denoted in purple here. We're talking about the ability to have your athletes come in and not have the obligation, but have the luxury to come in to use working out and fitness as a way to blow off stress. And then when we finish finals, we have an active recovery week. They're closing up their dorms, they're packing their stuff up, they're moving back home. And then the athletes on the off season during summer, because they have more background experience in training and programming, they would then be able to take the programming that we would provide to them, more than likely through an app like Team Builder, which is what I use, and deliver content through them that they can do remotely and then report back through how they're doing in terms of reps and sets and weights and everything else. But this broke out into a 3-week hypertrophy in preseason. So notice the difference in the phasings of this. We had mesocycles broken out. We have off season 1, then we have spring break. Off season 2, then we have finals and active recovery. Now we have preseason because we're looking towards the in-season phase or the in-season mesocycle. So you have a 3-week hypertrophy phase, a 3-week base strength phase. Then from here we have strength going in for 3 weeks. Excuse me. And then you have 2 weeks of power and then 2 weeks of peaking. So notice we have more time here, and you're hoping that your athletes are actually doing their work. And then when they come in, we do a battery of test out for them for strength as well as conditioning as well as power. And you can just run through like a whole library of different tests in your head that you've probably done. Could be bench press for reps. Maybe it's a push-up test for people who are deconditioned. We're doing squats, power clean. Perhaps it's box jumps, or vertical jump, broad jump, 300-yard shuttle. Could be 40-yard dash for acceleration. You get the point. It's whatever you as the coach and the sport coach want to come up with to evaluate the athletes. So then you get into in-season, and in the in-season we go back to being in the gray, and while in the gray we have the numbers color codified Roy G. Biv once again. We get into Thanksgiving, where you're still asking your athletes to do some work. More than likely they'll be on campus or only gone for a couple days, so we can still have them have that obligation. We get into nationals yet again, like we were talking about before, during this week, and then you have an active recovery week, and then you let them go ahead and do what they want at their leisure during finals week, and then you go back in and go right back into off-season 1 during that off season. So you can kind of get the idea of how you're constantly going back and forth between hypertrophy, base strength, strength, power, peaking. Now, I will tell you with some of your athletes, when they become trained enough and have enough experience in working out, they might not see a formalized hypertrophy phase, like a 2-week mesocycle, or as a book made to note it, microcycle for hypertrophy. You may throw in some hypertrophy oriented workouts with your chronologically older student athletes, and also your student athletes who have a higher training age. Sure, you might throw that in, or if your sport's more conditioning oriented, you might throw in a little bit more hypertrophy style training in a higher volume environment. But this would be a very typical how you would lay out programming for a sport that starts in August, and how you map out when your students come back on campus and program design out. Now, granted, depending upon the sport, depending upon if you're Division 1, 2, or 3, you might have spring ball when you're playing baseball. You might have winter softball, or I'm sorry, fall ball, if I can say it like that. In wrestling, you'll go through your wrestling season, then you go off, and some of your wrestlers will do folk style, which is a whole other style of wrestling in another season that's not NCAA. But my point to you is this: when you know those variables, then you can look at it on a calendar much like this and be able to map out what your intentions are and what you'd like to do. And this is broad-based category stuff, but I know, like in my head, hypertrophy, depending upon the sport, will be 15 to 12 reps, or 12 to 15 reps. I know maybe base strength, we're in 10s. I know I'm talking more like 6s, maybe 8s, but like 6s and 5s and 4s, 3 2s. And you're talking singles and doubles up here. I mean, I just know in my headspace how I would organize it out. So you'll get better at this, and you'll kind of like start to formulate your own opinion. Some of you, I'm sure, are into coaching different sports, and you'll be able to overlay this concept into your particular sport. I urge you just to kind of take all the different things we're doing in class and some of the things like this, and just kind of overlay them right into what you do. And that way you can have your own flavor, your own programming, and your own specificity to your own sport, and be able to be a great coach. So with that, guys, just so you have an example of how this works in terms of micro, meso, macro scale. I'm just going to go one last bullet point here, which I missed earlier. This would be the screen right you're looking at right now would be a macro scale. You're talking about the entire year, and then the off season 2, preseason, those would be particular mesocycles. And then week to week to week would be the microcycles in the context of what we're talking about in the NSCA and program design. All right, guys, breaking off from this, going to the next presentation. Thanks so much.